Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, setting the record straight about climate. I wasn't planning on making a video today, but the LA Times printed an article which was so dishonest that I thought I should spend a few minutes exposing what they've done. Here's the article. The California coast grew and prospered during a remarkable moment in history when the sea was at its tamest. But the mighty Pacific, unbeknownst to all, was nearing its final years of a calm but unusual cycle that had lulled dreaming settlers into a false sense of endless summer. Elsewhere, Miami has been drowning, Louisiana shrinking, North Carolina's beaches disappearing like a time lapse with no ending. While other regions grappled with destructive waves and rising seas, the West Coast for decades was spared by a rare confluence of favorable winds and cooler water. This sea level rise suppression, as scientists call it, went largely undetected. Blinded from the consequences of a warming planet, Californians kept building right to the water's edge. But lines in the sand are meant to shift. In the last 100 years, the sea rose less than 9 inches in California. By the end of the century, the surge could be greater than 9 feet. Before I get into the details, there's a few things in this article which stand out as red flags of bad journalism. The title says the California coast is disappearing, but down at the bottom it says, by the end of the century, the surge could be greater than 9 feet. This is a standard trick of climate alarmists. In the title they claim something is happening, but when you get down into the body of the text, all that they're actually saying is that something could be happening a century from now. The other warning flag is sentences like this. This sea level rise suppression, as scientists call it. Whenever you see a journalist say things like, scientists say, or as scientists call it, usually means they just made it up. Or perhaps they found one or two academics who were willing to go along with their scam. Let's look at the claim Miami is drowning. This is a webcam image from this afternoon. Doesn't look to me like it's drowning. Looks like the tourist industry is doing just great. And in fact, the beach looks pretty much the same as when I went there 50 years ago. The 1960 movie Where the Boys Are started with this helicopter ride up the Fort Lauderdale coast. And this is what the Fort Lauderdale coast looks like now on Google Earth. I'll flash back and forth between them a few times. Not much has changed in Fort Lauderdale. Looks just about the same as it did 50 years ago. This imaginary drowning of Florida doesn't seem to be hurting property values, where you can now pick up a home on the beach for only $159 million. Now we're going to look at 3 Noaa tide gauges in California, one in Southern California, one in Central California, and one in Northern California. The beach at La Jolla, California is one of my favorites, and they have tide gauge data going back for nearly a century. As you can see, the trend is linear and definitely has not accelerated. In fact, since the mid-1980s, there's been almost no sea level rise at all in La Jolla. This graph also from Noaa shows the rate of sea level rise at La Jolla. And you see it peaked in the 1970s and has been declining. This animated GIF transitions from an 1871 photograph of the cove at La Jolla into a modern high tide photograph. As you can see, there's been little or no sea level change at the cove over the last 150 years. About the only thing that's really changed is that this rock right here fell down into the water. This is a great snorkeling beach because there's a lot of brightly colored fish there. But the main problem there is that the water tends to be too cold. Now let's look at the Noaa tide gauge from Alameda, California, which is located in the San Francisco Bay. It shows very little sea level rise over the last 80 years. And particularly since the mid-1980s, there's been almost no sea level rise. This next graph shows the rate of sea level rise at Alameda, California, and once again you can see that it peaked in the mid-1970s and has been declining ever since. I've been going to the San Francisco Bay for the last 50 years and everything looks exactly the same. Now let's look at a Noaa tide gauge from Northern California. Crescent City's sea level has actually been declining over the last 80 years. And here's the sea level rate graph from Noaa for Crescent City. You can see that sea level is declining twice as fast now as it was during the 1970s. There's no indication that California beaches are disappearing. There's no indication of catastrophic sea level rise. Everything in the LA Times article is completely fraudulent. You have to wonder what their agenda is. Perhaps someone is trying to pick up properties on the coast and wants to scare people into selling cheap. If significant amounts of sea level rise were actually happening, it would be a problem that everyone would be aware of. Their beaches would be disappearing, property values would be plummeting. There wouldn't be huge numbers of tourists on the beaches today because the beaches wouldn't be there. Once again, this is very much like the story of the Emperor's New Clothes. These journalists are trying to convince people of things which they can't see and don't actually exist. George Orwell said, "Early in life I had noticed that no event is ever correctly reported in a newspaper." And the problem just seems to be getting worse. Journalists with an agenda seem to have no qualms with making up a story that has no basis in fact. Like this LA Times article. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science and propaganda for a long time.